Ethan Gray adjusted his tie nervously as the alien shuttle descended toward the grand palace of the Orathi. The distant towers shimmered under the twin suns, their metallic structures reflecting light in a dazzling array of colors. It was like stepping into a dream, a world so advanced and different from Earth that it left him momentarily breathless. Yet, the weight of his assignment kept him grounded. As an experienced human diplomat, Ethan had mediated conflicts on Earth and in other interstellar territories. But this was different. The Orathi were an enigmatic species, known for their elegance, intelligence, and highly intricate customs. Two factions within the royal family were on the brink of war, and Ethan had been sent as a last resort to broker peace. The shuttle landed smoothly on the polished landing pad, and the doors hissed open. A group of Orathi nobles awaited him, their tall, graceful forms adorned in flowing robes that shimmered like liquid metal. Their pale blue skin and white hair gave them an ethereal beauty that Ethan found both intimidating and captivating. Ambassador Gray, one of them greeted, her voice melodic, but with an unmistakable note of authority. "I am Counselor Vale. Welcome to Orathia." Ethan nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Counselor Vale. I hope I can assist in resolving the tensions between the factions." Val's expression remained unreadable as she gestured for him to follow. "Let us hope your efforts are not in vain. The princess awaits you." As they walked through the palace, Ethan tried to take in his surroundings without staring too obviously. The architecture was unlike anything he had ever seen. Walls made of translucent crystal, corridors illuminated by soft, pulsating lights that seemed alive. The air was perfumed with a subtle floral fragrance that felt calming and alien at the same time. They entered a large chamber where Princess Lyra stood, her back turned as she gazed out of a massive window overlooking the city. When she turned to face him, Ethan was struck by her presence. Lyra was stunning, with delicate features that exuded both grace and strength. Her white hair cascaded over her shoulders, contrasting with her intricately patterned robe. But what struck Ethan most were her eyes, large and shimmering, with a depth that seemed to pierce through him. "You are the human diplomat," she said, her tone measured but curious. "I am," Ethan replied, bowing slightly. "Ethan Gray, at your service, Princess Lyra." Lyra studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You are different from what I expected. Your people are not known for subtlety." Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "We may surprise you, Princess. Subtlety isn't always our strength, but we do try." A faint smile tugged at Lyra's lips, though she quickly masked it. "We shall see." The formalities continued, with Vale briefing Ethan on the upcoming discussions. It was clear that the Orathi court was divided, and tensions ran deep. Ethan noticed the sidelong glances and whispered conversations among the nobles. He was an outsider, and many clearly doubted his ability to mediate. Later that evening, Ethan was escorted to his quarters, lavish by human standards, but modest compared to the grandeur of the palace. As he unpacked, he couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was going to be far more challenging than he had anticipated. Standing by the window, he looked out at the alien city bathed in the light of the twin suns. "What have I gotten myself into?" he muttered. Unbeknownst to him, Princess Lyra stood in her own chamber, gazing out at the same cityscape. Her thoughts mirrored his own. This human was different, perhaps exactly what they needed. But could he truly navigate the complexities of Orathi politics? Only time would tell. The next morning, Ethan stepped into the Grand Council chamber, feeling a mixture of confidence and apprehension. The room was vast, with towering pillars of crystal that refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. Dozens of Orathi nobles were already seated, their robes flowing elegantly as they whispered among themselves. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, and Ethan knew he would need to tread carefully. Princess Lyra entered moments later, her regal posture commanding immediate respect. She moved gracefully to her seat at the head of the table, her gaze briefly meeting Ethan's before focusing on the gathered nobles. Ethan noticed the subtle nods of approval from some and the cold stares from others. Vale stood to speak, her voice carrying authority. Today we begin discussions to mend the divide between our factions. Ambassador Ethan Grey will mediate on behalf of the Galactic Alliance. All eyes turned to Ethan. He cleared his throat, trying to ignore the tight knot in his stomach. "Thank you for welcoming me," he began, his tone calm and measured. "I understand the challenges your people face, and I'm here to help find a solution that benefits everyone." One of the nobles, a stern-faced man with piercing eyes, scoffed. "A human thinks he can understand our struggles. Your kind is known for brute force, not diplomacy." Ethan held his ground, offering a polite smile. "I won't pretend to fully understand your culture, but I've studied it carefully, and I believe there's always a path to peace, even when it seems impossible." The noble didn't look convinced, but Lyra spoke before he could retort. "Let us not judge before we've seen what the ambassador can offer. We are here to resolve our conflicts, not create new ones." Her words carried weight, and the room fell silent. Ethan felt a flicker of gratitude toward her. As the discussions began, Ethan quickly realized how complicated Orathi politics were. Every statement was layered with subtext, and their body language conveyed messages he couldn't fully decipher. He tried his best to follow the nuances, but his straightforward approach often clashed with their more intricate methods of communication. At one point, a noblewoman raised an issue about resource distribution. Ethan, thinking it was a simple matter, suggested a balanced division. But instead of agreement, his suggestion was met with muffled laughter from some and disapproving glances from others. "What did I say wrong?" Ethan whispered to Vale, who sat beside him. She leaned in, her tone sharp but low. "Among the Orathi, it is considered disrespectful to propose solutions before hearing every side fully. You must listen before offering ideas." Ethan winced, nodding. "Noted. Thank you." Lyra, observing the exchange, intervened smoothly. "Ambassador Grey comes from a culture that values directness. While it is different from our ways, it may offer us new perspectives. Let us give him the chance to adapt." Ethan silently appreciated her words. She had given him a second chance to prove himself. After the meeting, Lyra approached him as the nobles dispersed. "You struggled today," she said, not unkindly. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's putting it mildly. Your culture is intricate." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "It is, but I've seen worse first attempts. You'll need to learn quickly, though. The court is not forgiving of mistakes." "Noted," Ethan replied, his tone lighter. "I'll do my best not to embarrass myself tomorrow." Lyra studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You have an honest way about you. It may serve you well, if you can temper it with patience." Ethan nodded. "Patience has never been my strong suit, but I'll try." As Lyra turned to leave, Ethan felt a small glimmer of hope. Despite the rough start, he sensed she wasn't entirely against him. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could navigate this labyrinth of politics and find common ground. Back in his quarters that evening, Ethan reviewed the day's events, replaying every mistake in his mind. He couldn't afford to fail. Not for his mission, and certainly not for the trust Princess Lyra had shown him. Outside, under the twin moons, Lyra stood on her balcony, watching the stars. She thought about the human diplomat, his missteps, his honesty, and the determination in his eyes. For the first time in weeks, she felt a faint spark of hope. Maybe this human could surprise them all. Late that night, Ethan wandered the palace corridors, unable to sleep. The day's events replayed in his mind. His mistakes, the muffled laughter, and Princess Lyra's quiet but reassuring words. He needed to clear his head, and the palace's vast hallways seemed as good a place as any. The soft hum of distant energy conduits echoed through the air, accompanied by the faint glow of crystals embedded in the walls. The architecture was as alien as it was beautiful, and Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the craftsmanship. As he turned a corner, He noticed a faint light spilling out from a partially open door. Curiosity tugged at him. It wasn't unusual to see lights in the palace, but this one seemed different. A soft, pulsating glow illuminated the edges of the doorway, almost inviting him closer. Ethan hesitated for a moment. This might be private, but his curiosity got the better of him. He gently pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was unlike anything he had seen before. It was filled with floating holograms, strange symbols, and intricate patterns that seemed to dance in the air. The walls shimmered with shifting colors, and the floor was made of a smooth, translucent material that reflected the light in mesmerizing ways. In the center of the room stood a pedestal with a glowing orb, its surface swirling with what looked like liquid starlight. Ethan approached cautiously, his steps echoing in the silence. The orb seemed to react to his presence, its glow intensifying. "This is incredible," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Just as he reached out to examine the symbols floating above the orb, a voice startled him. "What are you doing here?" Ethan spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing in the doorway was Princess Lyra, her pale blue skin glowing softly under the room's ethereal light. She wore no robes, only the natural markings of her species visible on her skin, intricate patterns that shimmered faintly in the light. Ethan's face turned bright red as he quickly averted his gaze, holding up his hands in apology. I didn't mean to intrude. The door was open, and I was just curious." Lyra's initial expression of shock softened into mild amusement. She stepped into the room, her presence commanding. "You have an unusual talent for finding yourself in places you shouldn't be, Ambassador." "I can explain," Ethan stammered, still refusing to look directly at her. "I couldn't sleep, and I was exploring. I saw the light. And—" Lyra interrupted him with a soft chuckle. "Relax, human. I am not offended. Though your reaction is interesting." Ethan risked a glance at her, noticing the faint smile on her lips. "In my culture," he said, trying to regain his composure, "privacy and clothing are, well, more strict." Lyra tilted her head, clearly intrigued. "Fascinating. You humans hide so much of yourselves, even among your own kind. It must be exhausting." Ethan managed a nervous laugh. "Sometimes, yes, but it's just how we are." Lyra stepped closer to the orb, her demeanor shifting to something more serious. "This room is my sanctuary, a place where I can think and reflect without the weight of the court. Few are allowed here." "I really didn't mean to invade your space," Ethan said earnestly. "I'll leave if you want." She studied him for a moment, then shook her head. "No, stay. You are already here, and perhaps it is time you see more of who we are." Ethan watched as she placed her hand over the orb. It reacted instantly, projecting a series of holographic images around the room. He saw scenes of Orathi history, battles, celebrations, and moments of profound sorrow. "This is our legacy," Lyra said softly. "Our past, our struggles, our victories. Do you understand now why we fight so fiercely to protect it?" Ethan nodded, humbled by the weight of what he was witnessing. "I do, and I'll do everything I can to help preserve it." For the first time, Lyra's gaze softened entirely. "Then perhaps there is hope for us after all." As Ethan left the chamber that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a bridge, one that could either unite their worlds or set them further apart. The stakes had never felt higher. The next morning, Ethan found himself at the center of the council chamber once again. This time, the air felt heavier. Whispers rippled through the room as the nobles glanced his way, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Word of his late-night encounter with Princess Lyra's private sanctuary had spread, though no one mentioned it outright. Princess Lyra entered with her usual grace, her demeanor composed, yet Ethan noticed a subtle change. Her gaze held a flicker of something, trust, perhaps. As it briefly met his, despite the whispers, she showed no sign of embarrassment or discomfort, standing tall as the court's leader. As the discussions resumed, Ethan did his best to remain attentive and avoid another cultural misstep. Today's topic revolved around territorial disputes, a sensitive issue between the two factions. The nobles argued back and forth, their words filled with thinly veiled accusations and polite hostility. Ethan listened carefully, trying to piece together the layers of meaning behind their words. When a lull in the argument came, he cleared his throat and spoke. "From what I understand," he began, choosing his words with care, "both factions value this territory for its historical significance. Perhaps a joint stewardship could allow you to honor its legacy together." For a moment, there was silence. Then, one of the nobles, an older man with sharp features, sneered, "A simplistic solution, typical of humans. Do you think we can simply hold hands and sing songs of unity?" Ethan felt the heat rise to his face, but forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not suggesting simplicity. I'm suggesting compromise. Unity isn't easy, but neither is war. I believe your history deserves preservation, not destruction." Before the noble could respond, Lyra interjected, her voice firm. "Ambassador Gray speaks with sincerity, even if his approach lacks refinement. Perhaps we should focus less on dismissing ideas and more on finding solutions." The noble reluctantly fell silent, though his glare lingered on Ethan. After the session ended, Lyra approached Ethan in a quieter corridor of the palace. "You're learning," she said, a hint of amusement in her tone. "Verily," Ethan replied with a tired smile. "Every time I think I've said something reasonable, I end up offending someone." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "The Orathi value precision in words and actions. Your directness is refreshing, but it takes time to adapt." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Time isn't exactly on my side. If these talks fall apart, I'm not sure what comes next." For a moment, Lyra's regal mask slipped. She leaned slightly closer, her voice soft. "You're not the only one under pressure, Ethan. Every decision I make is scrutinized. Every word I speak carries the weight of my people's expectations. It's exhausting." Ethan hesitated before responding. "I can't imagine what that's like, but I do know what it feels like to carry responsibility. You don't have to do it alone, though. If nothing else, I'm here to help." Lyra regarded him thoughtfully, her expression unreadable. "You truly mean that, don't you?" "I do," Ethan said simply. The sound of footsteps interrupted their conversation. Counselor Vale approached, her expression serious. "Your Highness, Ambassador Gray, there's something you should see." They followed Vale to a small chamber where a holographic projection displayed intercepted communications. The voices were distorted, but the message was clear. A faction within the royal court was actively working to sabotage the peace talks. Lyra's jaw tightened as she listened. "I suspected as much," she said, her tone cold. "This changes everything." Ethan frowned. "If this gets out, it could destroy any progress we've made." Lyra nodded, "Which is why we must act carefully. But this betrayal, it's personal." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll handle it together." For the first time, Lyra didn't pull away. Instead, she met his gaze and nodded. Together. As they left the chamber, Ethan realized something important. This wasn't just about diplomacy anymore. It was about trust, and building something stronger than the fragile alliances that had brought him here. Ethan and Princess Lyra spent the next few hours poring over the intercepted communications. The coded messages were fragments, but they painted a troubling picture. A faction within the Orathi court was plotting to disrupt the peace talks, ensuring the conflict between the two royal factions escalated. The motives weren't entirely clear, but Ethan suspected it was a play for power. Lyra paced the room, her movements sharp with frustration. "I knew there were whispers of discontent, but to sabotage the peace talks, this is treason." Ethan leaned against the table, studying her. "They're betting on chaos to strengthen their hold, aren't they? If the talks fail, They can consolidate power while the rest of the factions are busy fighting. Lyra stopped pacing and looked at him. Exactly. And if they succeed, it won't just be our people who suffer. This war will ripple across the galaxy. Your galactic alliance will have to intervene, and no one will walk away unscathed. Ethan nodded grimly. Then we can't let that happen. We need proof, enough to expose them publicly. Lyra frowned. It won't be easy. They're careful, and their influence runs deep. If we make one wrong move, they'll turn the court against us. Before Ethan could respond, Counselor Vale entered the chamber. She looked uneasy, her usual composed demeanor slightly shaken. Your Highness, there are rumors spreading among the court. Some are saying that the human diplomat is overstepping his role, interfering in matters that don't concern him. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Let me guess, our friends in the conspiracy are behind that. Vale nodded. Most likely. They're laying the groundwork to discredit you before you get too close to the truth. Lyra's eyes narrowed. Then we need to act fast. Vale, is there anyone in the court we can trust? Someone who might have information about these traitors? Vale hesitated before answering. There are a few, but they'll be cautious. If they speak out, they risk everything. Ethan stood straighter, his expression resolute. Then we give them a reason to trust us. If we can find just one piece of solid evidence, something undeniable, we can turn the tide. Lyra studied him for a moment, her gaze calculating. You're surprisingly optimistic for someone facing an uphill battle. Ethan shrugged. Optimism's part of the job. Besides, you'd be surprised how often the right people step up when it matters most. Lyra allowed a faint smile. Let's hope you're right, Ambassador. Later that evening, Ethan and Lyra met with one of Val's trusted contacts, a junior court official named Saren. The meeting took place in a secluded garden under the twin moons, the soft glow of bioluminescent plants casting an otherworldly light on their faces. Saren was nervous, her eyes darting around as if expecting to be followed. If they find out I'm speaking to you, my life is over. Lyra's tone was firm but reassuring. No one will know. You have my word. Saren hesitated, then leaned in closer. I don't know everything, but I've seen messages passed between Lord Kale and his allies. They speak in riddles, but it's clear they're planning something big. There's a storage chamber in the eastern wing. Kale uses it to hide documents and other items he doesn't want discovered. Ethan frowned. Do you have access to this chamber? Saren shook her head. No, but I know when it's unguarded. If you move quickly, you might find what you're looking for. Lyra nodded. You've done well, Saren. This information could save countless lives. Saren's expression softened, a flicker of relief crossing her face. I hope so. Please, be careful. As Saren disappeared into the shadows, Ethan turned to Lyra. Looks like we have our lead. Lyra's expression was determined. And we'll follow it. Tonight. The palace corridors were eerily quiet as Ethan and Lyra made their way toward the eastern wing. Every step felt heavier, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about uncovering the truth and protecting both their peoples. As they approached the storage chamber, Ethan glanced at Lyra. You ready for this? Her gaze was steely. More than ever. With that, they pushed open the door, stepping into the unknown. The storage chamber was dimly lit, with rows of shelves stretching into the shadows. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust, and every creak of the floor beneath their feet felt louder than it should. Ethan and Lyra moved cautiously, their eyes scanning for anything that might confirm the conspiracy. There must be something here, Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, his fingers brushing against a stack of old scrolls. If they're hiding anything important, it won't be obvious. Minutes turned into an hour as they searched, the tension growing with every passing moment. Just as frustration began to set in, Ethan spotted a locked chest tucked away in the far corner. Its polished surface gleamed faintly under the flickering light. This looks promising, he said, motioning Lyra over. She knelt beside him, her delicate fingers tracing the ornate carvings on the chest. It's locked, but this design. It's Orethi royal encryption. Only someone of high rank could open it. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Like you. Lyra gave him a faint smile. Exactly. She placed her hand over the locking mechanism, and the chest clicked open with a soft hiss. Inside were stacks of holographic data disks, neatly organized, but clearly labeled with coded symbols. One disk caught her attention, a glowing insignia of Lord Kel's house emblazoned on its surface. This is it, Lyra said, lifting the disk carefully. This might be the proof we need. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. His heart raced as he turned to Lyra. We've got company. Lyra quickly secured the disk in her robe. We need to leave. Now. They moved swiftly toward the exit, but as they reached the door, a group of armed guards appeared, blocking their path. At their head was none other than Lord Kell himself, his sharp features twisted into a smug grin. Well, well, Kell said, his voice dripping with mockery. What a surprise to find the princess and her human pet snooping around where they don't belong. Lyra's expression hardened. Step aside, Kell. You have no authority here. Kell chuckled. Oh, but I do. You see, Your Highness, I've been watching you. Your little alliance with this human is endearing, but it's also a threat, and threats must be dealt with. Ethan stepped forward, his tone firm. You mean to stop the peace talks. You're willing to let your people suffer for your own gain. Kell sneered. Spare me the human morality. You don't understand the complexities of Orethi politics. Lyra's voice cut through the tension like steel. What I understand is that you've betrayed your people. When this comes to light, you'll have no place left to hide. Kell's grin faltered for a moment before he gestured to his guards. Seize them. The guards moved toward them, but Ethan reacted quickly. He grabbed a small device from his pocket, a portable flash emitter designed for emergencies. Pressing the button, a blinding light filled the room, stunning the guards and giving them the chance to escape. Run, Ethan shouted, grabbing Lyra's hand and pulling her down the corridor. They sprinted through the twisting hallways, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The palace seemed endless, every corner leading to another unfamiliar passage. But Lyra's determination kept them moving. She knew the palace better than anyone, and her instincts guided them to a hidden exit. Bursting into the cool night air, they didn't stop until they reached the safety of Lyra's private chamber. Both were out of breath, their faces flushed with adrenaline. That was too close, Ethan said, leaning against the wall. Lyra held up the data disk, her expression triumphant despite their narrow escape. But we have what we need. This will expose Kell and his allies. Ethan nodded, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. Then let's make sure the whole court sees it. As they caught their breath, the weight of their discovery settled over them. They had the evidence, but the battle was far from over. The conspiracy was larger than they'd imagined, and the risks were greater than ever. Yet, for the first time, they felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next. Ethan and Lyra sat in the dim light of her private chamber, the data disk glowing faintly on the table between them. The night outside was quiet, but they both knew that danger lurked just beyond the palace walls. Lyra's fingers brushed against the disk as she stared at it. This contains everything. Proof of Kell's betrayal, his communications, and his plans to sabotage the peace talks. Ethan nodded. We need to present this to the court immediately. Once the truth is out, Kell and his allies won't be able to hide. Lyra hesitated, her gaze thoughtful. It's not that simple. Kell has powerful supporters. Even with this evidence, they may try to discredit us or turn the court against me. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. Then we make it impossible for them to deny the truth. We'll need a public setting where they can't control the narrative. Lyra's eyes lit up with understanding. The assembly chamber. It's where major decisions are made, and it's open to all the nobles. If we reveal the evidence there, Kel will have no chance to silence us." "Exactly," Ethan agreed. "But getting there without being intercepted is the tricky part." Vale entered the room at that moment, her face pale but determined. "Kel has ordered patrols to search the palace for you both. He's spreading rumors that you've stolen royal artifacts and are plotting against the crown." Lyra's expression hardened. "He's trying to turn the court against us before we can reveal the truth." Vale nodded. "He's desperate, but that makes him dangerous. If you're going to the assembly chamber, you'll need to move quickly and carefully." Ethan stood, his resolve firm. "Then let's not waste any more time." The palace corridors were eerily silent as Ethan, Lyra, and Vale made their way toward the assembly chamber. They moved swiftly but cautiously, keeping to the shadows and avoiding patrols. The tension was palpable, each footstep feeling louder than it was. As they approached the chamber, they encountered a group of guards blocking the entrance. Lyra motioned for them to stop, her mind racing for a solution. Ethan whispered, "We can't fight our way through. We need a distraction." Vale stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "I'll handle it. They won't suspect me." Before Lyra could protest, Vale walked confidently toward the guards. She began speaking to them in a low voice, gesturing animatedly. The guards seemed momentarily distracted, their attention focused entirely on her. Ethan and Lyra seized the opportunity, slipping past the guards and into the assembly chamber. The massive hall was empty but grand, its high ceilings and intricate designs giving it a sense of importance. Lyra approached the central console, inserting the data disk. The holographic display lit up, filling the room with glowing images and audio recordings. Ethan watched as the pieces of the conspiracy unfolded before their eyes. Kel's secret meetings, his orders to sabotage negotiations, and his plans to seize power. "This is it," Lyra said, her voice a mix of relief and determination. "This will expose him." As she prepared to summon the nobles, the chamber doors burst open. Kel entered, flanked by armed guards, his face twisted with fury. "Did you really think you could outmaneuver me?" Kel sneered. "Hand over the disc, and perhaps I'll show mercy." Ethan stepped in front of Lyra, his stance protective. "You've already lost, Kel. The truth is right here, and it's about to be seen by everyone." Kel's eyes narrowed, and he motioned to his guards. "Seize them." But before the guards could act, the chamber filled with the sound of footsteps and voices. The nobles were arriving, drawn by the summons Lyra had sent moments earlier. Kel's expression faltered as the room filled with witnesses. Lyra stepped forward, her voice ringing with authority. "Let them see, Kel. Let them see the truth you tried to bury." The holographic display began playing, revealing Kel's betrayal for all to witness. Gasps and murmurs filled the chamber as the nobles processed the evidence. Kel's face turned pale, his confidence crumbling under the weight of his exposed treachery. One of the senior nobles stepped forward, his voice stern. "Kel, you have betrayed not only the crown but our people. You will answer for this." Guards loyal to the crown moved to apprehend Kel, who struggled but was quickly subdued. Lyra turned to Ethan, her eyes reflecting both relief and gratitude. "You did it," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "We did it. Together." As Kel was led away and the nobles began discussing the next steps for peace, Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment. The journey wasn't over, but they had taken the first critical step toward unity. For the first time since his arrival, he believed they could succeed. Together, they would build a better future. The assembly chamber buzzed with activity as the gathered nobles reviewed the damning evidence displayed before them. The images and recordings of Lord Kel's betrayal played on an endless loop, each one more incriminating than the last. Whispers of shock and anger rippled through the crowd, and the once powerful Kel stood bound in the corner, his defiance replaced by a sullen glare. Princess Lyra stood at the center of the room, her voice steady and commanding. "You have all seen the truth. Kale and his allies conspired to destroy the peace we have worked so hard to achieve. They sought to divide us, to pit our people against each other for their own gain. This cannot be tolerated. A murmur of agreement spread among the nobles, their initial skepticism of the human diplomat now overshadowed by their fury at Cal's betrayal. Ethan watched from the side, feeling a sense of pride and relief. They had done it. They had exposed the conspiracy. But he knew the hardest part was still to come. Gaining the trust of the court and securing lasting peace would take more than just unveiling one traitor. One of the elder nobles, a woman with silver hair and piercing eyes, stepped forward. "Princess Lyra, the evidence is undeniable. But what do you propose we do next? Cal's removal alone will not solve the deeper divisions within our court." Lyra nodded, her gaze sweeping across the room. "You are right. The damage runs deeper than one man's treachery. We must work together to rebuild trust and unity among our factions. And that begins here, today." She turned to Ethan, her expression softer. "Ambassador Gray has proven himself not only an ally but a friend to our people. His presence here is a reminder that unity is possible, even between those who are vastly different." Ethan felt the weight of every gaze in the room as Lyra continued. "I propose that we continue these peace talks with Ambassador Gray as our mediator. He brings a perspective unclouded by our internal conflicts and a determination that we can all learn from." A wave of murmurs passed through the nobles. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked skeptical. Finally, the elder noblewoman who had spoken earlier raised her hand for silence. "I, too, was doubtful of the human's presence among us. But his actions have shown his dedication to our cause. I support the princess's proposal." One by one, other nobles voiced their agreement. Even those who had been hesitant to accept Ethan's involvement began to soften. It was clear that the court was beginning to rally behind Lyra's leadership. As the discussions continued, Cal, still bound and surrounded by guards, finally spoke. "You think this changes anything?" He spat, his voice filled with venom. "The divisions in this court will remain. No matter what speeches you give, you cannot erase centuries of mistrust." Lyra turned to him, her gaze cold. "Perhaps not in a single day, but we will try. And your defeat is the first step toward that goal." Cal's words hung in the air, but their impact was diminished by the resolve in the room. The nobles were ready to move forward, and Cal's bitter defiance only solidified their unity. Later, as the chamber began to empty and the nobles returned to their quarters, Ethan and Lyra stood side by side near the central console. The weight of the day's events lingered between them. "You handled that brilliantly," Ethan said, breaking the silence. Lyra gave a small smile. "I had help. None of this would have been possible without you." Ethan shook his head. "You're the one who led them. I just gave you the tools." She turned to face him fully, her expression serious but warm. "You gave me more than that. You reminded me that trust is possible, even in the darkest moments. For that, I am grateful." Ethan smiled, feeling a rare sense of accomplishment. "The fight's not over, though. There's still a lot of work to do." Lyra nodded. "Yes, but for the first time, I believe we can do it. Together." As they left the chamber, the faint light of dawn began to creep through the palace windows. It was a new day, and with it came the hope of a better future for both their worlds. The morning sun filtered through the crystalline walls of the palace, casting shimmering rainbows across the corridors. Ethan walked beside Princess Lyra as they made their way to the central courtyard, where a gathering of nobles and citizens awaited. The air buzzed with anticipation. Today would mark a turning point for the Orcs people, and for the fragile alliance with humanity. Ethan adjusted his jacket, still feeling slightly out of place in the grandeur of the palace. "Do you think they'll accept the treaty?" he asked, his voice low. Lyra's expression was calm but focused. "They have to. The evidence against Cal was undeniable, and the nobles see the need for unity. But change is never easy. There will be resistance, even now. Ethan nodded, appreciating her honesty. Well, if anyone can lead them through this, it's you. Lyra glanced at him, a small smile breaking through her serious demeanor. You have more faith in me than I sometimes have in myself. I've seen what you're capable of, Ethan replied. That's more than enough for me. When they reached the courtyard, a hush fell over the crowd. The nobles stood in formal rows, their flowing robes gleaming under the morning light. Behind them, citizens from all walks of life filled the space, their faces a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Lyra stepped forward, her regal presence commanding the attention of everyone present. Ethan stayed a step behind, watching as she addressed her people. My fellow Orthi, Lyra began, her voice carrying across the courtyard. We stand at a crossroads in our history. For too long, we have allowed division and mistrust to cloud our vision. But today, we take the first step toward healing. She gestured toward Ethan. This human diplomat, Ambassador Ethan Gray, has shown us that unity is possible, even between those who are different. He has stood by us, risking his life to uncover the truth and protect our future. Let his actions remind us that strength comes not from isolation, but from cooperation. Ethan felt a wave of warmth at her words, though he kept his expression neutral. This was Lyra's moment, not his. Lyra continued. The conspiracy that sought to tear us apart has been revealed, and its perpetrators will face justice. But justice alone is not enough. We must rebuild together with honesty and trust. That is why I am asking all of you, nobles, citizens, and allies, to join me in signing this treaty. She held up the document, its glowing text a symbol of hope. Let this be our promise to each other, a promise to seek peace, to protect our people, and to honor our shared history. The crowd remained silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. The sound was deafening, a wave of support that seemed to echo through the entire palace. Ethan couldn't help but smile. This was more than he had hoped for. As the nobles stepped forward one by one to add their signatures to the treaty, Lyra turned to Ethan. We did it, she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. You did it, Ethan corrected. I just helped a little. Lyra shook her head. You helped more than you know. When the last signature was added, Lyra lifted the treaty for all to see. The courtyard erupted in cheers, the sound carrying far beyond the palace walls. Ethan glanced at Lyra, noticing the pride and determination in her eyes. She had truly become the leader her people needed. Later that evening, as the celebrations continued, Ethan found himself standing on one of the palace balconies. The twin moons hung low in the sky, their light casting a serene glow over the city. Lyra joined him, her presence quiet but comforting. You're leaving soon, aren't you? She asked. Ethan nodded. My mission's complete. The Galactic Alliance will want a full report, and there's plenty of work waiting for me back on Earth. Lyra studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. Thank you, Ethan, for everything. He took her hand, holding it firmly. Thank you, Princess, for trusting me. As they stood there, the weight of their shared journey seemed to lift. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt full of possibility. And for Ethan, that was more than enough.